on mute while other people are talking, actually for the whole event, would be fabulous. If you have questions for Koa or for Kirsten, if you could please put them in the chat, that would be wonderful. There will be time to go through those and answer them. Just be respectful of other people. Feel free to put in the chat, hey, I'm Chelsea from the class of 2013 and I'm in Oakland. That'd be great. We would love to see you and see where you're from. Finally, we want to share that Mills College is on Ohlone land and acknowledge that we have current use of that land. But we thank the Ohlone people for their presence in the past and their stewardship of the land in the past, their presence in the present time now, and their stewardship of the land and their culture now, and of their presence in the future and their stewardship of their land and their culture and in our culture and lives in the future. We're obviously not all gathered on the Mills campus right now, unfortunately, but it's still important to acknowledge that we're grateful and thankful for everything that they have done in the past, the present, and what they will do in the future. Finally, before I pass it along and introduce you to one of our professors who needs no introduction, I'd just like to remind you all that you can purchase Koa's book, White Feminism, which you can kind of see behind me. I tried to make that my background at Pegasus Books. Koa's really excited to support that location because they were a great spot for them to hang out with during college, and we really encourage you to support a local institution. They have pickup and in-store and shipping purchase options, so please do so if you feel the urge. Now, I am going to go ahead and bring on someone who has been at Mills for a long time and is, in fact, a graduate of Mills. And I'm so pleased I'm going to spotlight you, Kirsten, before I start, just so you're there for everybody. This is Kirsten Saxton. As I'm sure you all know, Kirsten is an award-winning teacher, a professor of English at Mills, and an alum from the class of 1990. Her scholarly work focuses on how reading 18th and 19th century texts broadly understood through anti-racist, feminist, queer, and crip theoretical positions offers us productive ways to understand not only historical texts and contexts, but also our own cultural moment. Her writing is centrally concerned with embodiment and gender, as it is presented in popular narratives from the 18th century to the present. Her scholarly books include a monograph on the murderess, a collection on early British woman writer Eliza Haywood, and a 2019 edited collection on teaching entitled Adapting the 18th Century, a handbook for pedagogies and practices. She's a founding editor for 2 scholarly journals and currently runs a mentorship program for women and non-binary scholars in her field. As an Oakland native, she is particularly delighted to be a part of the We Are the Voices Mellon project on Oakland Arts Scholarship and activism with Mills professors Sheila Lloyd, Awan Mance, and Stephanie Young. Her scholarly work and her teaching are braided, ongoing conversations and her work with students at Mills College motivates and shapes both her intellectual and activist commitments. Kirsten, you obviously have the floor. Please take it away and thank you for being here with us.
I'm so excited to see everybody. I feel like I have to comment that it's really funny. I broke my laptop, so I'm in this little writing cottage that looks like a boudoir. So I had to put scarves over the windows because it was really bright, and I feel like very maximalist femme in this space right now for everybody. So anyway, I am bemused, and I'm really wanting you to notice how professional Koa's background is and be like, yes, good job. Okay, so also forgive me because I'm on a different computer and I'm probably going to look really strange, like the wrong way, like that way that people do on Zoom. They look sideways, and I'm going to use some notes. So there are my caveats. So welcome everybody, alums, friends of Mills, friends of Koa, and whoever joins us here today. I hope that all of you are doing as well as you can be in this really overwhelming moment. And I'm grateful to be with everybody, to be able to think and talk about ideas and create community. It's really, really a privilege, and it's one I don't take for granted at all. So thank you for being in this space. Thank you to Koa, thank you to Chelsea and the Alumni Association and everyone who worked to make this event happen, but also thanks to every single one of you for showing up and being here together today. So I am going to wax like long intro rhapsodic, and I'm going to tell you why I get to do that. It's not only because Koa is 1000% deserving of this, and this book is amazing, but also she was my student. Like, so this is such a super meaningful, amazing thing, and I could not be more excited. I am over the moon to have the honor to get to introduce Koa Beck and to be in conversation with you and with her about her important new book, White Feminism, Looking Backwards, because I don't know how to do that thing that Koa did that makes it look the right way. From suffragettes to influencers and who they left behind. So this book challenges and inspires us to go beyond narrow individual notions of personal liberation and have us think about how to build genuinely collective movements for justice. Also moments, but moments make a movement. And I'm going to use my notes so I don't mess up. So Koa is a splendid writer. She's a splendid editor and intellectual thinker and human. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that I think we can trace back in some way to her, time at Mills, perhaps. She graduated the class of 2009. She currently pretty recently relocated from New York and lives in LA with her wife. And we're hugely grateful of her donation of her time today. I just want to let you know, in case you don't know, in case you didn't Google properly, that Koa had like 2,500 people on her Zoom last week with like really, really famous people. So it is incredibly generous. Like, we matter, Mills matters, but it's really generous of her to take this time and to donate her time to do this kind of event when she's also on like the Today Show. Like, very, very much appreciated. So white feminism comes out of Koa's long history of generous curatorial practice and a long history of activist writing. And I'm going to talk some in the conversational questions about how her time at Mills informs that history and that practice. Her writing spans genres. She's an award-winning literary critic, fiction writer, and a journalist. And across each of these genres, her writing is trenchant, clear, elegant, and always engaged with the critical issues of our moment. So Koa's been a major figure in mainstream media as a producer and curator of content. She was the editor-in-chief of Jezebel, as well as a former executive editor of Vogue and a former senior features editor at Marie Claire. Even within the confines of these pretty mainstream women's media spaces, Koa always worked to center race, gender, LGBTQIA rights, and issues of class. So, for example, when she was working at Vogue, she took on Trump's assault on kids via transphobic bathroom policies. In Marie Claire, she wrote thoughtfully about the beauty boys of Instagram. You can Google all these cool things. I'm not going to tell you about them. And in an essay on the Atlantic Monthly, not her most recent one, which is about this white feminism issue, but an older one, she took on issues of labor in households. In a personal essay in Salon, she explores the complexities of being, of her own experience as being white passing and straight passing. And in addition, she's a wonderful fiction writer. She's been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, and she's currently working on, maybe finished, I don't know, a novel, which I can't wait to read and buy. And in her nonfiction writing, including white feminism, Koa brings not only a really elegant prose style, I feel very qualified to say that as an English professor, but an acute, critical, and theoretical eye to the intersections of pop culture and what we call high culture. And she's always refusing those bounded distinctions. And this, I think, is the space of some of the most important and interesting writing today. In 2019, Koa received the prestigious Joan Shorenstein Fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School Center. And she moved then from like sort of bustle New York, I'm imagining like newsroom culture, into like, hallowed quiet archives where she deep dived into the historical research that ended up with the paper. Harvard requires, I think, that you produce an academic paper as part of these fellowships. And her paper was entitled Self-Optimization in the Face of Patriarchy, How Mainstream Women's Media Facilitates White Feminism. So the meticulous archival research from that work is really braided in elegantly into white feminism, and that's one of my favorite things about the book. So I personally, as a reader, particularly appreciated these sort of micro histories. Things like, and maybe you all know about this, but little like pieces about the 1902 woman-led kosher meat boycotts, or the sit-in for disability civil rights in the 70s, the anti-corporate roots of the Dyke March in the early 90s. And Koa's deft braiding of this historical research with engaging personal narrative and compelling cultural analysis demonstrates not only that she's an exceptional writer, because that's very difficult to do well, but also its result is that the book has a scope and a reach that I think is critical to its activist focus. For those of you who have not yet read the book, White Feminism documents the long and troubling ideology that has dominated the American women's movement from the start. So at that moment, that's our pivot. That's the end of but right now, can we just be like, how impressive is that? Like, aren't you impressed? I'm so impressed. Like, yay, super impressive. And now we'll be like, now we're going to move to like have questions. So I will move to official questions. I haven't actually done this before, like where you go back and forth on Zoom in questions. So Koa, if I like don't ask the next question at the right moment, you can be like, Kirsten, what's your next question? Because I'm like afraid that I'll just get sort of so carried away.
We'll learn together.
We'll learn together, which is a delight across all of the ways that we've interacted. So this book crucially defines white feminism, not just as feminism practiced by individual white women. So it's not like, there's Kirsten, she must be a white feminist because she's white, but as an ideology. So I wondered if you could just talk through for all of us your core thesis about white feminism as an ideology, particularly.
Sure. And before I do, I just want to thank you and Chelsea and all the Mills alums and community for being here, and especially being in conversation with you. I feel like brings me full circle in a way that just makes me feel amazing. And that this, I say this in the acknowledgments of the book, but you are the first person from whom I learned how to think about gender critically. So this really means a lot to me. I very intentionally define white feminism very early in the book, in the introduction, to give the reader a working definition of what I'm tracking and then, what I'm tracing as we move through the present day. I define white feminism as a very specific approach and ideology towards achieving gender equality that pulls considerably from colonialism, imperialism, some key pieces of white supremacy as well, and especially labor exploitation, and deeming individual accumulation of wealth and autonomy as indicative of feminist progress. Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted because my water bottle is loud. How could you ever be in a Zoom where someone doesn't have to say, excuse me, you're muted? All right, so I love the way that you frame the book with theorist Sarah Ahmed's quote from Living a Feminist Life. And her quote is, if talking about racism within feminism gets in the way of feminist happiness, we need to get in the way of feminist happiness. So I'm wondering, how does your book define a sort of white feminist happiness, and how could you talk in some detail about how that happiness is sort of reliant on an illusion of whiteness as a superior category and as an aspirational category?
I feel like specifically in my own lifetime, I have watched, quote unquote feminism, however you're thinking about that or quantifying that, but literally the word and to some extent, the practice, be sanitized of a lot of its, radical thinking and basis and critiques, and be morphed into this really like rose gold like hologram where like everybody has a really clean like email inbox, and like everybody works in an office, and everybody's like 28 years old or like trying to be 28 years old and is like going to Pilates and just like really kicking ass at a white collar job. And I've watched that, you know, become not only more prominent, but also like defining of like what, you know, quote unquote feminism is, but also what we should be hurtling towards. Is this very like, again, you know, this is pre-COVID, but this very like, you know, stylized open office plan, you know, that happens to have a pumping room. And then, you know, everybody has like these really high-end smoothies that, you know, are filling and nutritious. And I've watched it in some ways, and you know, through the study of this book, I learned that this isn't new. This has actually been an evolving narrative of, you know, women's rights in this country. But to push in this more highly individualized understanding of what feminism is and what it should be in terms of your needs, you know, as a woman or a non-binary person, instead of, you know, what I think of, and like a lot of texts that were very formative to me, and a lot of thinkers, you know, in the feminist canon that thought more collectively about, you know, structural oppression, and then, you know, critiques and feminist action, again, along a broad spectrum, are about everybody having access to clean water, everybody having access to a certain bathroom, everybody having access to affordable childcare, not one individual woman from a very specific community achieving something and then everybody trying to replicate her strategies, which I feel like is an enduring piece of what white feminism espouses.
Absolutely. And I want to later at the end, maybe we'll circle back to some of those notions about that sort of aspirational culture. So your book beautifully traces the connections between that kind of white feminism, right? That's sort of what's happening now with the rose gold. And I'm really taken by the way you used objects there that signify, right, to all of us. We're like the rose gold. I totally have a rose gold computer stand to my right. I just want to say.
So do I.
No, exactly. I'm not saying that. So in other words, I want to point out that I don't think your book is saying like individually one's participation in a sort of object fetish or the enjoyment of a sort of discourse thing is responsible, but it's also not perhaps the end game. But I think that the way that you talked right then using specific examples of material objects and a kind of branding culture is beautifully done in the historiography of your book when you talk about the connections between white feminism, branding, and consumer culture. And your research takes us not just back to like, you know, the 80s, sort of like all those advertisements. I don't know if you probably before your time, but the advertisements of like from Virginia Slims as a feminist act to like the, you know, you can bring home the bacon, fry it up in a pan, right? Like it's not just from there, but rather you locate us in the early 20th century branding of the suffragette, who is sort of purged of radicalism. And I mean, I could not believe this, outfitted by Macy's. This was me like going, what in the middle of reading? And I mean, I know a lot of these things and I did not know these things. From that moment up to our current moment of sort of hashtag smash the patriarchy, water bottles, or smoothie stickers, and influencer culture. So I wonder, since most people have probably not read the book yet, if you could do a sort of little mini history of that consumer linkage argument.
Sure, happily. It's one of my favorite parts of the book as well. And also, I didn't know it prior to researching this book. So a lot of, you know, the white feminist like aesthetics that Kirsten and I were just talking about, you know, where you have like a girl boss mug and like you're, you know, wearing like a Nevertheless She Persisted t-shirt and like you're at Women's March with like a, you know, feminist tote bag. I interpreted that, you know, as somebody who, depending on who you talk to, would be situated in the fourth wave, although that's debatable. I interpreted that as very like new commodified approaches to feminism, and also just like kind of per usual, right? Like anything you value will be sold back to you in the framework in which we live in this country. Everything will be commodified. But when I was researching the book and going through a lot of archival research, I found this incredible historian named Margaret Finnegan, who I cite in exactly this passage where, and I found archival representations of this when I was doing my fellowship, essentially that, all of this like girl boss, this idea that you participate in feminism through buying, that you participate in politics through buying, that you should, as a feminist, buy March On lipstick by Elizabeth Arden, which is real. That is not new. The middle to upper class white suffragists in this country, they also, yes, who just wrote Goldie Block's Toys. Yeah, exactly, correctly that. The middle to upper class white suffragists in our country, they really pioneered that strategy in that in, approaching the political idea of suffrage and also the strategy that they were going to employ, they had something new at their disposal that say like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were about a generation earlier than them, didn't have, which was like consumerism and like shopping, frankly, where in, around a little after the turn of the century, now department stores were a big thing. Shopping centers in general were a big thing. Now, the average like middle class American, especially woman, when they weren't in the home, they were spending time in all these boutiques. They were at like counters. They were looking at things they could buy. There was also like mass production that was newly available. And so in approaching achieving the political goal of suffrage, a number of these thinkers and activists decided that they would intentionally use consumerism and production and merchandise to spread the gospel of suffrage. And so the way they embarked upon this was kind of what we see now. Like they made all these, votes for women sashes and pins and luggage tags and valentines and, bonnets. Kirsten alluded to this earlier, but one specific suffrage organization claimed that, or not claimed, they basically partnered with Macy's and said that Macy's was the headquarters for suffrage. There was an official suffrage blouse that you were encouraged to buy. A lot of boutiques on Fifth Avenue in New York had window displays that were all decked out in suffrage colors. And again, it was this idea that you would show your allegiance to suffrage by buying. And that was very surprising to me because again, I came to a lot of this, from my own generational standpoint in terms of like, God, this is such a, in some ways, like bastardization of feminism, but it's not a new practice, but it is a very deeply white feminist practice.
And one of the things that I think is really important that you talk about in your book is that particular whiteness of that commodification, so that the imagery, for example, if you look at the imagery of 19th century suffragettes, they sort of look like mad and, blocky and like, right. And that she gets a sort of like a makeover. It's like a suffragette makeover. So she becomes like skinnier and in like the wavy white dresses and a kind of figure that to me, and you talk about this and you use great images, so sort of just suggests a kind of traditional aesthetics associated with whiteness. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, very, very much so. Essentially in taking a lot of, suffrage representations in-house, a lot of these middle to upper class white suffragists, they were trying to combat, this notion that like suffragist was, this shrill, scary other who like wanted to become a man and vote and like all this weird like gender class policing stuff. And so the way they decided to, it's very PR, like the way they decided to like get out in front of that narrative was to manufacture in-house like who a suffragette was. So the exact woman you were supposed to think about. And like Kirsten just said, they very intentionally homogenized her. She was very light skinned. She was very skinny. She aspired to be a wife. She aspired to be a mother. A lot of suffragette depictions around this time, it's like a woman who is either middle class or clearly aspires to be middle class, and she's like clutching and protecting a child, to indicate that like she knows her place and her role, even though she wants to vote, she'll still take care of children, so don't worry. And again, for this era, there were Black women suffragists, there were Native suffragists, but when I look back on the archive of quote unquote suffrage materials, there's only one woman who is depicted, and it's very homogenous, and she's very gorgeous, and it was very intentional for a lot of those thinkers and those activists, in that they were playing into a lot of this kind of like American paternalism, in that they were trying to say, you know, when you are against suffrage, you vote down suffrage, you're voting down this very gorgeous young woman who wants to do everything that you want her to do. And it was very successful campaigns.
Well, and it's associations then of also aspirational womanhood as white womanhood feel still really, really important. Not so much, I mean, because it's both linked to a kind of actual just racism, just good old fashioned racism, but also a kind of construct of aspirational whiteness that we see talked about sometimes today, like that it's not like being a white person necessarily, but it's sort of being able to embody those aesthetics and those prerogatives become like sort of the right way to do feminism. Like that's the narrow guise. So now I just want to like shift us back a minute and head back to Mills and Mills Hall and your years at Mills, when Koa and I were accidentally still talking when you guys came in. One of the things we were talking about is I have this totally really specific memory of walking from Mills Hall to the tea shop with Koa, talking about her dad and like literary influences. And it's just one of those like kind of golden moments. And so I know Mills had golden moments and also complicated moments. And I was really moved by your articulation of the sort of contradictions and disappointments and sort of beloved narratives that came from your time at Mills. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your time at Mills as it has informed your thinking, particularly in terms of the ideas that you put forth in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, and I say this in the acknowledgments of my book too, I feel like Mills really shaped me as a thinker, and, you know, to my advantage. Something that I think I picked up I picked up directly from Mills, very organically. Like I don't remember registering this, you know, as an undergrad, but I learned how to think very critically about structures at a really young age. And I noticed there was a difference in that, you know, when I got to be older and was professional and was like working in newsrooms and working, you know, with other women who identified as feminists, other, you know, non-binary people who identified as feminists, I did find that to be a distinguishing factor, in that I was trained, I think, in a lot of classes that I had across a lot of different subject matter, to question authority and to question dominant messaging and to question homogenized narratives of how certain things have come to be. And when I got older, I had, you know, I think a kind of abrupt realization that everybody has when they leave Mills, which is that like not everybody had the very formative, you know, instruction that I had. And even to see like, you know, certain women that I have worked with or, you know, have respected, really buy like wholesale like into white feminist narratives, which I feel like as a Mills student, I just wasn't predisposed to do that by virtue of the people I learned from, but also the texts that were put in front of me as, you know, a late teenager that in a lot of ways I think became, you know, foundational to the way that I think about gender. I mean, I graduated, as Kirsten said, in 2009, and it's very, I think, like important timing to consider that when I started writing professionally and trying to get jobs, you know, in media, feminism, again, however you want to interpret that, was suddenly in and like trendy, and, you know, whereas, you know, when I was coming up as a teenager, feminism and feminist was a very stigmatizing word. It was a very divisive word. It was definitely something you didn't want to be called if you could avoid it, you know, in certain settings. And then very quickly, as like a young person, all of a sudden, like all these influential pop stars identify as a feminist. Again, no interrogation of what that means, but so I feel like a lot of really foundational texts and arguments and authors that were put in front of me by people like Kirsten, by other professors, set me up to be very skeptical of what was happening, because I didn't come to feminism from Taylor Swift. I I come to feminism from Judith Butler, from Bell Hooks, from Audre Lorde, from, all these people who were put in front of me as an 18-year-old. So I think in some ways, Mills imbued me with a lot of very intuitive skills to clock white feminism and to assemble this book.
Thank you. So speaking, kind of jumping off of that, I was thinking about the ways of sort of who's in the room right now, and I can't see you all because if I mess around with the view, it'll be all terrible. But I know that there are current students who are here right now, and I know that there are alums from some time back. And one of the things that I was thinking about a great deal when reading your book, and then in the context of this discussion, is the different way that this book and its arguments land for its different readers, right? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about who you imagine reading the book, who's been in touch with you in response to reading the book. If you could talk a little bit about how it seems to sort of work with both the person who's identified as a white feminist or hasn't even thought about this and is like, wait, you're interrupting my happiness, or the person who's like, hello, I've been thinking about this and living this for generations. You know what I mean? Like, just if you could talk a little bit about audience.
Sure. I had a really amazing editor for my book who I cannot say enough good things about. Her name is Michelle Herrera Mulligan, and I actually met her when I worked at Mary Claire. She was actually the editor at the time for Cosmo for Latinas, and actually she and I used to low key critique the white feminism in the company that we both worked. And then some years later, she ended up being my editor for this book, which is also really cool. But when I chose her and we decided to work together, I was super clear that, I didn't necessarily want to write a book that was aimed exclusively towards white women or white feminists. I really wanted to engage with the feminist archive. I wanted to braid in my own experiences to continue this narrative, but I wanted to have the opportunity to speak to different audiences, which if anyone has ever worked with a publishing house or any sort of corporate entity, that's not what they want to hear. They want to know who the audience is, and they want your book to do well in that sector. And so me talking about speaking to different audiences, they ended up going for it, but it's not typically, what a lot of those gatekeepers want to hear. So I think the result in this book is that in editing it and then also writing it, I have places where I think I am, directly speaking to people who are not very queer literate, who are not very class literate, who are not very racially literate. But then I also have other spaces where I feel like, I'm not speaking to those people. I'm actually speaking to other readers who perhaps do have a more robust history of either queer movements or indigenous movements. I really wanted to write a book that met people where they were. And so depending on your own literacy or your own understanding of feminism, you would be able to get something out of this. It may not be the same thing that, your friend would, or your daughter, or, any of your colleagues, but I wanted to do something that was very textured, but also very large in scope, because I feel like for a lot of, my own personal navigations with white feminism, one-to-one, but also just ideologically, in workplaces or even, certain companies I've had to cover, what is missing is history and historical context. And there's a reason that, for generations, Black feminists have been saying the same things. And there's a reason that, for generations, Chicanas have been saying the same thing. And I really wanted to not only summarize the points, of these great thinkers, because I don't really think that does a service to them, but I wanted to, actually make you read Bell Hooks. I wanted to actually make you read Cheryl Clark. I wanted you to engage with the archive in a way that white feminist narratives don't. So I feel like the book works, in an antidote in that way. But per that, the book hasn't been out that long, but I was telling Kirsten when we sat down, a thing that I am really enjoying so far is that the book is reaching very different people with very different understandings of feminism and very different like gender literacies. A big part of the book promotion process is that your book, you know, goes to all these like book bloggers, like, you know, all over the country, and you don't know them, you know, you don't know what books they like, but it's just part of the sort of marketing process. And to that end, like, I'm getting all these messages on social media from these like very sweet and in some ways like humbled, you know, middle class, like white, you know, stay-at-home moms who are reading this book and who, you know, just tell me that they're learning so much. Like they didn't know anything about indigenous movements. They didn't know anything about Dyke March. Like they didn't know that the future is female is actually a deeply radical lesbian phrase. And like this one woman wrote to me very sweetly, just saying that like she's learned so much from my book and she's like saving it for her daughter, who's like 4, by the way, so she won't be reading it anytime soon. But you know, that sentiment is very sweet, that people who have existed, you know, in this very white, white aspirational understanding of what women's rights are through this book realizing how they ended up there and the fact that they don't want to stay there. And then on the flip side, like I have, you know, very, very radical, self-identified radical people who are reaching out to me on social, saying that, you know, they really enjoy seeing how, for instance, like their fat politics relates to actually like a lot of like queer activism, which, you know, given how they came to it, whether it's like Tumblr or like Instagram, you know, they hadn't really made that connection that like fat feminism and fat politics is deeply queer and therefore influenced by like queer theory. So I'm very proud of that because, you know, when I was having initial conversations about executing this book, that was my dream for how it would be received. And so far it's panning out. It's early yet, but we'll see.
It's one of the things that really blew me away because it didn't, I was thinking a lot before I started reading it, like who are you pitching this to, right? Like, how is this gonna land? And I feel like, I mean, I know a lot of some things, like a fairly good amount, like, but there were still things that I hadn't thought about, right? Or that I didn't know, or that I hadn't put in conversation with one another, right? Like somebody just did a great tweet about like your arguments are like little toys, and you're like, play with this one, like it's just like all these things that are like in conversation with each other in ways that are generative, and they're generative partly just by proximity, right? You're showing their historical genealogical proximities. And the mixing between, like, if you haven't read the book yet, the mixing between archival history, contemporary pop cultural, like of the moment stuff in the workplace, in the world, and just your own experience being in women's magazines, being in newsrooms, being in physical spaces, being queer, being, you know, at mills, in being not white, all of those things together make the book really successful, I think, as an actual project rather than just sort of hitting a bunch of things. And it made me think about, it's like the best class, right? When, if you guys think about like right now, like the best classes that you had, they were not because somebody just handed you like a Virginia Woolf, to quote, like, to, for those of you like who are like really sad because you thought this was going to be my mom, I'm super sorry. I think she's here now. You can totally direct chat her.
Ruth is here?
I think so. I think she is.
Hi, Ruth Saxton.
She was, but she might have hidden.
I really wanted to take your Virginia Woolf graduate level class when I was an undergrad, but I wasn't allowed to. But that is like my biggest regret.
I'm with you. I didn't continue. But my mom talks a lot about, there's like the difference in the one Woolf talks about giving someone a nugget, right? Like that's one kind of intellectual exercise. You're like, here's the nugget of wisdom all wrapped up with a bow, right? And that is a particular kind of intellectual exchange, pretty transactional. And that I think when we think about Mills and great teaching, or any of the kinds of formatively really exciting intellectual moments that we have, they're not that, right? They're not that. They're actually like messy and interesting and complex and raise questions and make you follow rabbit holes and do think you rabbit holes, is that the right word? Yes. Yeah. And isn't that funny? Do you ever say a word and you're like, is that the word?
All the time.
Good. So I feel like one of the real strengths of the book is its refusal to be pigeonholed And that's a really hard thing to do in this market in publishing right now, right? Like not to say like, yes, this will go to like only this one book club in Indiana, right? Or it'll go to like recent mill students. So, all right, I have another question. Here we go. This is the last one. It has a lot of words, too many words. Look how many words in that question. Okay, but you don't have to pay attention to all of them. So in the book, you call for a feminist praxis and an ideology that is foundationally intersectional, meaning that it's sort of like the opposite of white feminism for those people who don't use that term, right? You're thinking about all the different forms of identity, positionality in conversation with one another fundamentally, not just like, here's a Black person and here's a queer person, or oh, look, we found one that's both Black and queer. Yay, right?
We're done.
Right, we're done. So you're calling for an ideology that is the sort of non-white feminism, right? So an ideology that is more radical and more inclusive. And I did want to just shout out your citational praxis. So for the intellectual geeks in the room, like who you cite is like who you invite to dinner, right? So if you want to find out something about who somebody thinks, who have they invited to who's at the dinner party? Who's around that table? If the only people around that table are all the same kind of people, that says something, even if at the dinner party, they're talking about how they would really love to have 27,000 other people at the dinner party. So a sort of one way to talk about this is the hashtag like cite Black women, or that, right, just an idea that it's both who are you literally in conversation with, who are you inviting to your table, and also there are metrics in those citations, right? It actually counts, like it counts whether or not you're cited by people and how that works. So I was really impressed and wanted to just sort of highlight that it makes a big difference, right? You're not doing that. Like there's also a sort of move that people do where they read the academic work and then they turn it into a pop version with a footnote that says like, I was informed by these people for this idea, but they're not actually like front loading it.
I don't appreciate that. I know what you mean. I've seen that in books that I've read and I'm like, nah.
You're like, just like, yeah, they're not invited to the dinner table. You're like, I did some great takeout from that place. It was terrific, but they don't get to sit here with us. So you cite so many people, but off the top of my head, it's like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Barbara Christian, Cheryl Clark, right? Carla Trujillo, Kimberly Crenshaw, Sylvia Rivera. Like you've got the kind of dinner party that we all want to go to. Like, the best dinner parties are the parties with like all these different kind of people together. And when I was thinking about that, it made me think about what you talk about in the book and what I think about in life a lot, which is an idea, a distinction between diversity and inclusion, which is a kind of ornamental, I think you put it, like the thing I referenced sort of half sarcastically, right? That you're going to have the Black person and the trans person, and then look, maybe you can get two in one. So that kind of representation versus other kinds of representation or structural change. And I was thinking then maybe you could, before we move into questions, talk about what, as you put it, a multi-gender browner feminism might look like. What does it look like to refuse white feminism and its priorities? Giving us something to be,
Well, I want to thank you so much for noticing my bibliography, because I did spend a lot of time on it. And I really, I not only wanted to cite people just because, these are the people who have influenced my gender consciousness and should be cited when I'm talking about all these different ideas, but again, in an effort to, meet people where they are, I really wanted to set up the bibliography of the book so that, if you are interested in my book, I encourage you to keep reading. Like, I got these ideas from all these important thinkers. And, for a lot of classist, heterosexist, and racist reasons, some of these thinkers are not in what is traditionally deemed the feminist canon. And that's part of the overall critique. So I not only want you to know that their ideas are theirs, but I want you to go in search of them And a lot of people, especially on the book tour for this book, have been saying, like, what do you recommend that we read, after white feminism? And I'm always like, go to the bibliography, like, pick anything. You have all of the reading that you could want to do, for the next 5 years in the back of that book. So that's what I would say. So thank you for noticing that. That means a lot to me. Also, because you are my professor, that means a lot to me. I would say, so something that I consistently tracked through the white feminism ideology and its enduring principles and the way that it existed 100 years ago and the way that it exists now is that in both practice and then also like the aspirational pieces that it traditionally espouses, the assumption is just that everybody has a basic standard of living. And then like white feminism starts from there. So if everybody is food secure, if everybody is housed, if everybody has healthcare, if everybody, is really treated okay by our criminal justice system, then we're just focusing on like educational opportunities and then like small business and enterprise. And that's really what white feminism has consistently prioritized in their movement is education and then small business and enterprise. When I think about rethinking white feminism, but in some ways like completely getting rid of white feminism altogether, and in some ways like making a more holistic movement that is for everybody, I think of really starting at basic need, and coming to feminism and gender oppression from a place of how do we make sure everybody is food secure? How do we make sure everybody has access to clean water? How do we make sure that everybody has housing that is affordable? How do we make sure everybody has healthcare? And a reason I think about it that way is like, especially in my own professional life, something I've watched happen, and you pretty much alluded to this earlier, is like, I've had to cover so many like feminist conferences. I've had to move in so many like feminist sanctioned spaces. And yet time and time again, what I see is like, the topics of discussion are set, the panelists are invited, all the logistics are put together, and then at the 11th hour it's like, oh, are we intersectional? And the way that this is like ameliorated is through like kind of what you said, like, oh, we'll invite one Latina, okay, we're done. We'll invite like one trans person and then we're done. Whereas, as somebody who has had to cover events like that, or in some instances as somebody who's like sat on those panels, my instinct is really like, okay, but if you started at like housing, your panel would organically be intersectional. You wouldn't have to like reverse engineer it to be diverse to basically uphold a bunch of topics that are not. So that's my thinking, that it's like if we actually assembled a movement that started at basic need, we would, by virtue of that practice, not be white feminist in our politics, or even like what we're advising other women and non-binary people to subscribe to.
That was super inspirational. That was a great answer. I'm super excited that this is recorded. And I just want to say that like when you're done with the super book tour and being like the famous person, like you should be in a classroom. Get Harvard to bring you back in a classroom, right? Because it's like that kind of like actual thinking out loud and being present and being in conversation. It's fantastic. So thank you. I think that's it. And also I want to just reflect back to you that answer does something that I think doesn't get done very often, which is I think often when we talk about the larger we in anything, a sort of aspirational, not aspirational whiteness, which somebody noted in the chat is a big key, right, of white feminism, whether you're white or not, right? This idea that like a version of life that is quote unquote normal, that is like, if it's queer, it's kind of like a sanitized version of queerness that's like,
it's a bougie version of queerness. It's like, yes, you have a 300 person heterosexist wedding with like a bougie bridal registry, but it's gay.
Right. So there's often sort of that kind of version. And then people are like, well, we want like a different thing. We want to like fix this. How do we fix this? How do we like, and part of that is change your thinking, understand history, do that. But also, I really, really, really just want to make sure everybody got that notion that if you start with a different issue, right? If you start with, it is super important to get women in STEM in college. Absolutely. I mean, for sure, right? But if you're also starting on, there's been a lot of discussion of like some kinds of issues that we all know. But if you talk about what are some of the reasons that you don't see as many people in these educational things or in these spaces, you end up talking about physical safety, food insecurity. You know, we have a food pantry at Mills, y'all. Like people are like the basic needs stuff, and then the example back to like switch the topic at your fancy event, right? And you will like de facto change who's at that table. And I'm loving the idea of like the dinner table, the kitchen table, the conference table, like all of them need to be like, we need to have more people that we're breaking bread with, whether that bread is the bread of, you know, actual food or citations or panelists, right? Like the part of this is that you have to be in proximity and in conversation with different people with different priorities, or you're just going to keep replicating the same thing with different sort of ornaments. So thank you for that answer. That was really, really, really like brilliant. So I think we should move it open into the questions. And I have, so we didn't quite win at Zoom, you guys, because Zoom has like this better way to do questions where only the questions go in one place. But because Mills remains as charming and like delightfully idiosyncratic, right? We like didn't really figure we didn't know that thing existed. So what we're gonna try to do is go through that chat, but there's a bunch of questions in it. So we may need some help collectively getting at those questions, right? And not missing them. I am terrible at tracking the chat. My students know this, and they always have to yell at me, like I tell them to.
Do you want me to do it, Kirsten?
Oh my God, yes, I really do. Is that terrible?
Yeah, no, I'll do it. Yeah, I do it for other talks that I do.
I'm going to claim this is generationally awesome and not just that I'm bad at that. I'm just going to hold on to that.
Okay, what I'm going to do so that it's like somewhat democratic is that I'm actually going to start at the bottom and then scroll back. I will be including your name and your year. Okay, so Chrissy Cunningham, class of 98, says, does all this consumerism seemingly attempt to absolve people from doing the work? I think it has the capacity to do, especially when I consider that, like in my lifetime, I've watched feminism and feminist practice be commodified. So when I look at like many of the movements that I cite in my book, for instance, like empowerment at its core is challenging power and like the feeling that rushes in from when you challenge power, you know, whether that's like going to a protest or like working with a union or like walking out, you know, of an oppressive job with like a bunch of other people you work with, that's empowerment. And yet I have watched in especially the last 10 years of my career, like especially post Lean In, consumerism be presented as like the feminism. So the way that you feel quote unquote empowered in these commodified settings is that you exchange money for like feminist experiences. And that can run the gamut from like, you know, some of these conferences that I've had to cover through the course of my career through like co-working spaces, for instance. But I have a lot of theories in my book as to like what that does, like to this idea of feminism if you're paying money for it. If you're paying for feminism, I think that's like suspicious, like to the nth degree. Like if people are legit looking you in your face and asking you to buy your feminism, that is white feminism. So many other movements in our country that are, you know, either feminist identified or have worked, you know, towards gender progress for like specific people in their community. You know, they don't pay money to be feminists or to engage in feminism. They usually rally together in the capacity that they can and challenge power in ways that they design. So I think that, to bluntly answer your question, I think the consumerism does in some ways like dull activist efforts, in that it kind of sells literally this idea to consumers that like, if you buy this lipstick, if you patron this co-working space, if you go to this conference, you are a feminist. And that is like the beginning and end. And nobody can tell you ever that like you know, have harassed women or don't support women, because you were a member of the wing. So clearly, like, you could never violate or perpetuate anything. I hope that answered your question, Chrissy Cunningham. Okay. I'm just moving through your very colorful commentary. Okay. Louise Leck asked Koa, what are the books you read at Mills that informed you best? We're going to be here a while. The ones that really stand out to me, actually, Kirsten was the first person who formally introduced me to Edna St. Vincent Millay in terms of like collections of her poetry. I had read like a couple of her poems, you know, as like a 15-year-old, but I wasn't really aware of like her body of work. And actually, one of the first classes I took when I was 18, Kirsten taught Intro to Literature, which I had to take, and we studied quite a bit of Edna St. Vincent Millay in that class, which I really liked. I also really loved The Awakening by Kate Chopin. I remember being really thrown by this idea that like a female protagonist who exists in a story, sorry, I'm going to spoil this book for people who have not read it, but if you all go to Mills, you should have read this book already. She dies in the work, and I specifically read that book in a class called Dead End Women. It was not a standardized class at Mills. It was not an elective, but we had a version that we would call them special topics. That's what it was. That was like did you see that? That was like my 19-year-old brain just came out with that. And so for that course, we specifically read literature, and later at the very end watched Thelma and Louise, which was brilliant, to analyze stories in which lead female protagonists die, and then analyze like what that ultimately says about like the culture, society, politics at the time. And I think, not surprisingly, you know, for many people who are in the audience, like it generally came down to like three very intense rules, right? Like, she has sex outside of marriage, so she will die. She doesn't like care too much about social pressures, so like House of Mirth. Or she is like blatantly transgressive to like gender roles, like Daisy Miller. So like those kinds of dynamics. And I really loved The Awakening by Kate Chopin. And then let's see, I also read, these weren't necessarily for classes, but I checked out a lot of books at the library when I was at Mills. I was always reading. I loved the library there. It's probably the place I spent the most time. I remember reading a lot of Plath poems in college and really loving them. I read for a different survey that I took of American literature. We read Emily Dickinson, which I really loved. I love her whole, like, I had a funeral in my brain. Like, I think that's incredible. Yeah, those are some of my favorite books. Okay, I'm scrolling back. I'm looking for a question mark. I think, oh, okay, here. I'm going back to the bottom because I think I've scrolled through all the other ones. What are the most important things you would like to say to people who have read the book? Or alternatively, what are the questions you would most like to ask the people who have read the book? Oh, that's really thoughtful. I think what I would like to say to the people who have read it is that I really hope that you have ended the book with the, I guess, the thing you cannot unknow, like the thing that nobody can ever like convince you of otherwise, that there has never been a singular feminism. It sounds very simple, but yet, like when I look at the narratives that, white feminist ideologies and even like capitalism and like marketing and, like mainstream feminism have tried to tell us for a long time, it's that, there's a default feminism, and that default feminism is white feminism. It's mainstream feminism. And I mean, I don't think that, and I don't, even prior to this book, like I don't come to feminist discourse, from that place. And I also, attribute that understanding to Mills, where I read a lot of varied perspectives on feminism as a very young person. So I feel like I couldn't even like say, the monolithic feminism thinks X, which like when I got older and again, started working in professional spaces, other people felt comfortable saying that. And I remember thinking like, well, who are you talking about? You're talking about like Angela Davis? You're talking about Steinem? Like who? And so I think if you have read the book, I hope that you have walked away with the deep understanding that there have been many feminisms and many gendered movements and many people who have thought critically about gender, and that these feminisms that are not white feminism in their practice, they have been very successful in their strategies, by not in a lot of ways like kowtowing to what white feminism always has, by working outside of sanctioned respectability, by eschewing capitalism in some capacities, by not willing to, be what would go down easier or what would like market best. These aren't, niche movements. These are like very prominent movements that have been in some ways like edited out of the feminist canon. So I would like to say that to you. I see one more, I think, a couple more questions. When I was younger, magazines like Cosmo and 17 and Teen Vogue were not at all involved or dedicated to social justice or feminist issues, but rather the constant push of Western beauty values. In recent years, they have started to involve and publish more transgender, feminist, non-binary, queer political articles. Have you looked at them? And if so, how would you evaluate their take on feminism, and how far do you think they have to go to distance themselves from white feminism? I have looked at them. Many of the, certainly not all of them, but many of the outlets you describe, I have worked at sister sites for these publications. So Mary Claire, where I worked for a long time, is owned by the same company that owns Cosmo. And Vogue, where I worked, owns Teen Vogue. They were like one floor up from us. I think that I do get into this dynamic a bit in my book, in that I think that a lot of those outlets that have involved, queer thinkers and queer writers and people who are outside the gender binary, I think those are good opportunities for those writers. But I look at this a bit more holistically because of my field, and also a lot of what has driven those companies to hire people like this. And a big sort of like component that I feel like you referenced a bit in your top question is that fashion, for instance, as like just a topic, when a lot of these mainstream women's outlets went online, fashion very quickly became not a high traffic content measure. And what I mean when I say that is that, if you have a pretty glossy print magazine and you have like pages and pages of really beautiful dresses, for a certain part of the pre-digital era, that worked, in terms of like editorial content. People bought them to see the pretty dresses. Now, people go all kinds of places to see pretty dresses. Instagram, Pinterest, their favorite influencers, like all types of stuff. And so fashion as a staple, and beauty too, to some degree, are not high traffic verticals anymore. So if you want to sustain readership, you actually have to move into other arenas. Fashion can still exist in some capacity, usually if it has to do with like what we used to call like a tentpole event. So yes, there's the Oscars, right? And some people wear pretty dresses to the Oscars, but people care about the pretty dresses because they're at the Oscars. I literally used to assign this coverage, so I know what I'm talking about. And so, you know, for Teen Vogue, for instance, and this has been reported, this is out there if you can read it, they had to change editorial strategy. And politics was a much more, in some ways, like clickable narrative than fashion and beauty were. So I think that, you know, this was not an altruistic endeavor. It wasn't that, you know, one person got to the head of Teen Vogue and was like, you know what, like, very earnestly, like, we shouldn't be, you know, exporting this beauty ideal anymore. We should actually be more political. There were a lot of mechanics behind the scenes that facilitated that, and many of those mechanics are conducive to capitalism. The only reason this would work is because these companies were like, oh, we'll still get ad revenue, because a lot of people will click on the fact that, like, I don't know, this actress got arrested, you know, in the Dakota Pipeline March. Done. So there's a lot more there than just the earnest need to like graciously extend bylines to queer writers. Another, I think, kind of like grotesque facet of this is that in a lot of these spaces, these like heavily corporate spaces that actually pay the salaries of, you know, people who work at Teen Vogue, people who work at 17, is that, you know, they want to seem on trend. And like, as vile as it sounds, you know, and I've been across this in meetings, queer topics, again, a very narrow section of queer topics, are weirdly trendy for them. And so in an effort to, I would say, like, really exercise ageism in some capacities, they want to seem very of the moment, and that includes having a lot of queer and non-binary writers. Now, that doesn't mean that like these opportunities aren't brilliant for those non-binary writers, because they get bylines. They don't get paid very well, and that is also out there that you can read about. So that's another metric to consider. Many of them don't have decent health insurance, but it looks good for the company. Okay. Alison McCracken wrote, oh, yeah, same, or no. I'm unclear if this is the right name or not, just because of how it came in. No, this is Barbara Williams. What impact do you think, or would you hope, the minimum wage increase would have on ideas of white feminism in particular, and feminist thought in general? I am, in a lot of ways, you know, delighted to see minimum wage conversations be as like nationally covered as they are, you know, in the sense that even this week, just looking up like the $15 minimum wage and seeing like the number of outlets that covered that. I don't know if, and I'll have to look, you know, I don't know if a number of mainstream women's outlets covered it. But I think that, as I cite in my book, I mean, labor has always been a big part of gender and feminism. And I feel like this is where like white feminism can be, in some ways, its most deliberate, in that, you know, women trying to achieve a $15 minimum wage, that doesn't necessarily fit in with the whole like lean in vibe of feminism, you know, in which like you should be making or aspire to make six figures. You should aspire to have this like C-suite, you know, big leadership, like lots of responsibility. These are women who are literally just looking for a living wage. And so I support that as a, you know, as a feminist argument. But as far as it relates to white feminism, I think there's a reason that, you know, a lot of those conversations on like, again, like that type of wage gap, as opposed to like wage gaps at the top, have been not a part of white feminist discourse. And even like, 100 years ago, they weren't. A big point of tension that I get into in my book is that like the middle to upper class white suffragists, they tried for a spell to work with what historians call industrial feminists. So these were the women who were primarily immigrant, working class. They worked in a lot of the like laundries and factories, and they tried to work together because those industrial feminists were interested in, exactly this type of feminism. They wanted a minimum wage, they wanted bathroom breaks, they wanted weekends, they wanted to be able to leave at a certain amount of time. They didn't want to be just endlessly exploited. And, the white feminism of that time did not see that as a pertinent feminist issue. And so their time working together was really truncated. And, white feminists went on to kind of like how Kirsten and I were saying earlier, like really push for, all women to go to an elite school and like run companies. And then the industrial feminists stayed focusing on, labor issues like the $15 minimum wage. I believe, let's see, this is kind of the same question. Louise Leck asks, and this can be our last question, what have you highlighted about white feminism and labor in your book? A lot. I intentionally cited a number of labor movements in this country to a lot of times show the ideological weaknesses in white feminism in terms of what, the reality that white feminists were pushing for, as opposed to, again, like industrial feminists, working class feminists, immigrant feminists. I also get into a lot of consumer activism and how women, especially housewives, to a certain degree, were very influential in that movement. And I think that it's a major part of feminism and gender history that white feminism doesn't go anywhere near. Labor issues, whether it's like safety or wage protection or like healthcare, white feminism has never gone anywhere near that. Anything to do with like economic policies too, white feminism has never gone anywhere near, as far as I can tell. I think that's all the questions. I don't see any more, and I did a thorough scroll.
Thank you, Koa. Thank you for managing that so beautifully, both at the structural and it's so metonymic of your whole like book thing. You're like structurally deeply competent and also gracious and full of information. I'm loving it. So I am not in charge, so I need to find out what Chelsea's vibe is right now. But can I just say to everybody, could we do something a little bit weird that we do sometimes in classes? Could you unmute yourselves? Are you able to do that? Can you unmute yourselves? And can we clap for Koa for taking this time to be together with all of us? So yay, Koa, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to me to be able to speak to all of you. And again, to be in conversation with Kirsten, from whom I learned so much and still do and deeply look up to. And I wish I could be there, in person. I wish I could, stroll around Mills Hall and go sit on a bench by a fountain or something.
We'll make it happen.
We all wish we could do that.
We will make it happen. So Chelsea, I don't know if you have like formal words, so I'm going to mute myself again, or else Koa and I is going to keep chatting. It'll be super awkward. So,
Well, yeah, I'm so glad that this event has happened. And the only sad part about it is that when we originally started talking about it, it was to have something really nice and have Koa come to class, to campus and see students, face to face, and have, our alums come and just have it be more in person and interactive that way. And then of course, Corona hit, and this is what we have for now. Fingers crossed that soon, as long as we're all getting vaccinated and being safe, we won't be stuck in this virtual world for too much longer. But my ending words are really just to say thank you to both of you for sharing with us and talking with us and sharing this knowledge with all of us, for sharing your time. I think I've said that already, but it bears repeating. Time is money, and time is valuable and important in today's society, and we appreciate that you're taking this part of your weekend to be with us. And thank you to everyone who's been here for this event and who's been listening and learning along with myself and everyone else here with you. And yes, one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, besides repeating that you please can buy Koa's book at Pegasus Books, repeating that over and over again. I did not know that I could put captions on this video, and I just learned that. So it wasn't here for this event, but it will be in the future. And if you need a transcript of this recording, please email us at alumni-relations@mills.edu, and we'll make sure that happens. Anyway, thank you all for being here. And yeah, I think this is wonderful, and your class dismissed.
Koa, we'll continue this soon, but right now, go enjoy a little bit of a respite in your weekend, and thank you. And thank you, everybody. Okay, it's always the Zoom awkwardness. Let's see if we can all leave at the same time. 1,
Thank you for coming.
3.